Changing a country isn't easy, but change is inevitable. And the choices we make today will shape our country for generations to come. That's why we've published our first book from Australia Institute Press. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia, from leading thinkers such as Bob Brown, Sally McManus, Dr. Emma Shortis, and Professor Brian Schmidt. The essays are a roadmap and a reminder that the solutions exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to order your copy of What's the Big Idea today.
You have to assume that not all of those donors are making donations out of the goodness of their own heart. These are industries exposed to what the government decides to do or not do, and they have an interest in taking advantage of the access that political contributions can give them.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute. They've been described by some members of the crossbench as, quote, a major party stitch-up.
Today, the government introduces the Electoral Legislation Amendment, Electoral Reform Bill 2024.
What we want to put in place is electoral reform that lasts.
We don't want an American-style electoral system.
This increase in public and administrative funding is going to disproportionately benefit the major parties. Plain and simple.
This is all about transparency, it's all about accountability, and it's all about fairness.
What we're seeing is the major parties terrified of a minority government. They are terrified of being held to account and actually having more voices from the community who are accountable to their community, who don't have to toe some, at times really dumb party line.
After trying and failing to pass them late last year, the government's sweeping electoral reforms are back on the agenda, due to be discussed this week in Parliament. The legislation includes an increase in public funding of political parties and candidates, a cap on political donations and spending, and stricter requirements around political donations. The government says this bill will create a more level playing field in politics, but does that claim really stack up? Joining me today to talk about the reforms and the future of Australian democracy is the Institute's Democracy and Accountability Director, Bill Brown. G'day, Bill.
Hey, Eb.
Bill, I want to get to the electoral reforms in just a moment, but this week the Australian Electoral Commission, the AEC, published a year's worth of political donations data.
This is the biggest dump of donation data we're going to get before we head to the federal election.
Now, it's no surprise to anyone that the big corporations are making generous political donations to both sides of politics.
But remember, this is only for the last financial year, so it doesn't actually give us an insight into what's been happening since July of last year.
It's been 20 months since some of these donations occurred. We desperately need real-time disclosure of political donations.
Before we dive into reforms, what's happening with money in politics, Bill?
It'll take some days or weeks to fully digest the data, but the overall picture is that not much has changed in terms of the funding of the established political parties. If we look back at this same time in the last electoral cycle, the political parties, the major parties, received about $70 to $80 million each, and that's a bit lower from this year's reports, but otherwise pretty similar, around $60 to $70 million. The Greens a bit under $20 million. The Nationals around $10 million. One thing that's missing from these results is the United Australia Party, Clive Palmer's outfit. Because it was deregistered, we don't have as good a sense of what's going on there. And there had been a theory that because the government's proposing big changes to political finance, that people might be getting their donations in early before those limitations are in place. But that doesn't seem to be the case because we don't see an increase on funding versus this time in the cycle last time.
So who are the biggest donors revealed in that dump, or do we not know yet?
The thing that stood out to me from the list of major donors, those who've made their own disclosures to the Electoral Commission, is just how many industries are represented that are exposed to government decision-making. So we see political donations from the gambling industry, from a lot of healthcare and pharmaceutical,
interesting,
medical manufacturing companies. The management consultants and government relation firms are well represented, as you might expect. And of course, the minerals, energy, and fossil fuel industries, as well as high net worth individuals making their own donations, and for all kinds of reasons, I suspect. And you have to assume that not all of those donors are making donations out of the goodness of their own heart. These are industries exposed to what the government decides to do or not do, and they have an interest in taking advantage of the access that political contributions can give them. This also ties in with the problem that we are waiting up to 18 months to hear about these donations. If you cast your mind back to July, August, September 2023, the Albanese government was proposing changes to dispensing rules that affected pharmacies. And sure enough, we see contributions from the Pharmacy Guild of Australia coming in at that time, and while negotiations were going on in March of 2024. Now, those are the kinds of contributions that would add context to the political debate at the time.
At the time, yeah.
Waiting 18, 19 months to find out about them strips them of their political relevance and stops us from fully understanding what's going on in the moment.
In real time, yeah. It's a good observation. And so how do these donations translate into influence for special interests in our political system?
It's very difficult to say exactly what influence a donation or indeed other kinds of political contribution might have. But we know that the political parties do solicit what's called cash for access. That's where you pay a sum of money to have dinner with the Prime Minister or a meeting with a minister or other influential decision maker. And that doesn't have to be expensive. In fact, a lot of cash for access payments would never show up in this donations data because they're below the current disclosure threshold. But that's enough to get privileged access. Whether that can be turned into favourable decision-making is not something we're really privy to. But we know that access can be bought.
And you're talking there about these kind of come in under the threshold, so those kinds of payments aren't reported. How much of what the AEC publishes does it actually capture, particularly for the major parties and their total revenue?
We do find out about half of the money coming into the political parties, but that's coloured partly by the fact that the chunk of that is public funding, which of course we know about and could calculate for ourselves.
Yeah.
And then there are other large transactions that don't come as much of a surprise, like the affiliation fees that trade unions pay. One of my great concerns is that some of these larger donations may not be the ones that are exercising the most influence. A classic example is a bequest from someone's estate, which may be very substantial, but probably isn't going to change decision-making.
Yeah.
Whereas what we see in Victoria, for example, is when they put a cap on donations, cash for access suddenly gets charged at just below that donation cap. So there's a difficulty in tracking down which of the payments are actually having the most effect.
We've got a cost of living crisis going on out there, and the first thing these people give a damn about, these major parties, is their own goddamn pockets. I mean, it is shameful. Merry Christmas, Australians. Here come the major parties taking more of your cash.
So, Bill, last year on the show, we talked to you about the government's electoral reform bill, which Special Minister of State Senator Don Farrell described as once-in-a-generation reform. Can you just remind listeners of what exactly this bill constitutes? What are we talking about?
The Albanese government's proposed bill, I split into four main areas. there's a big increase in public funding. So after you run in an election, you get $3 per vote. This would go up to $5 per vote. And they'd bring in administrative funding for elected members of parliament. Another aspect is the improved disclosures. So whereas currently we have this long delay before donations are revealed and only large donations are revealed, that would change to real-time disclosure of some political donations and a lower threshold down to just $1,000. We also have plans for caps on spending. So you cannot spend more than X $1,000 in a particular electorate trying to win people's votes, as well as a cap on donations. So one political donor giving to one political party or candidate capped at $20,000 per calendar year.
So, Bill, there's some good portions of this reform, things that people have been looking for in electoral reforms for a long time, but there's also, I guess, some drawbacks or difficulties with the legislation that you've been looking into in particular. Can you tell us about a few of those concerns?
The changes to political donation disclosures are fairly non-controversial and have been a long time coming. It's back in the Howard government era that they raised that donation disclosure threshold. And those changes have support from integrity groups. We've also heard from the crossbench that they're supportive of those measures. That's quite different to the other changes to the political finance system, which haven't been properly tested. I'd argue that we need a parliamentary inquiry to get to the bottom of how exactly these changes will work. But already from the analysis that the Australia Institute did over the summer, we can identify clear loopholes in how they would operate. So for example, political donation caps. I said a $20,000 per donor cap. But what listeners might not be aware of is that what we think of as the political parties, Labor, Liberal and so on, are actually groups of several registered parties, meaning one donor could give 8 or 9 times to the Labor or Liberal parties, each time at that $20,000 cap.
So you could donate $20,000 to the Liberal Party in New South Wales and then the Liberal Party Queensland. Is that the idea?
Exactly.
Yeah, right. So does that then give the major parties a big advantage over, say, someone who's running just in one lower house seat and can't get contributions from any other party, essentially?
That's right. A small political party that only has the one registered party or an independent candidate. And another consideration for those parties and candidates is that if the cap applies every calendar year and you only decide to run for election in the election year, you're only eligible for one cap donation, whereas a party that's existed across the electoral cycle can receive a cap donation every year.
So while donation caps sound really good on the surface, when you look at how it would actually be applied, it actually could potentially tilt the playing field against new entrants and minor parties and candidates, I'm guessing.
That's exactly right. And the application is different, but the concerns are similar when it comes to the spending cap. The way the spending cap at the seat levels, there are 150 seats in the lower house of the Australian Parliament, and there'd be an $800,000 cap for each candidate in each seat. But for an independent candidate, that cap is on all of their electoral spending. But for a party, the cap is only on the spending targeting that electorate that names the candidate or seat. Put yourself in the shoes of a major party campaigner. You might run $800,000 of ads promoting your candidate, but then you're going to shift and run any number of other ads promoting the political party, promoting its leadership team, promoting its policies, and in effect you can outgun the other candidate many times over.
So the bill was met by vocal resistance from independent and minor party representatives last year, and it did get delayed until this year. But we know that over 30,000 people have signed an Australia Institute petition really calling for a proper review of the legislation. You've outlined some of those concerns, but to be clear, this legislation hasn't been sent to an inquiry in Parliament yet. Is that right?
That's right. There's been no parliamentary inquiry, and the government, by its own admission, describes these as the biggest changes to Australian elections in about 40 years. Normally, that's the kind of thing we'd expect to see thoroughly scrutinised. And it's worth mentioning too, there's no urgency here. The changes to the laws would not come into effect until the middle of 2026. So we have an election coming this year. Even if the laws pass tomorrow, they won't be in effect for this election. So why rush things?
Why indeed? And so Parliament is back. There's reports that this bill is again on the agenda. Have we got any other additional details from the government or anyone else about this legislation since it was shelved last year? Are there any plans to send it to an inquiry? Have there been any changes made? Do we know of any deals? What's going on?
We know very little about what's happened over the summer. The government certainly flagged that it was interested in consultation and negotiations, but we've heard from the crossbench that they don't feel like they've been consulted. I think Jackie Lambie speculated that the government might have been consulting with fairies and elves because she hasn't had kind of someone knocking on her door. The government is apparently planning to proceed, introducing legislation on Thursday, and I wouldn't be surprised if they do make changes. We got some information last year about what the coalition wanted if it was going to vote for the legislation. Whether that will materialise is unclear. What the effects on Australian elections would be from doubling or halving this cap or that cap or changing the definition of one set of words or another, we just don't know, because the area is too complicated for us to be making these kinds of assessments in real time.
So how would you like to see the bill improved based on your analysis of some of its flaws?
I think the simplest solution would be to split the bill in half. Let's correct the decades-long gap in Australian donation laws by requiring real-time disclosure of donations. Anything over $1,000 is what the government proposed. That has majority support in the Parliament, and it's well established. The Electoral Commission already handles donation disclosures. State governments already require donations of about that size to be disclosed in real time. So we know that those kinds of changes can work and could pass the Parliament. That would free up the rest of the bill to go to a parliamentary inquiry to be thoroughly scrutinised and for us to actually hear from some of the people who are going to be affected by these changes. Parliamentary inquiry could also ask some difficult questions of those who want tens of millions of dollars more in public funding. How do you spend the money currently? What checks and balances do you have that it doesn't go on misleading advertising? What are the governance arrangements in your party? All that would help reassure Australians that these could be positive changes.
And Bill, you've just touched on there an issue. I mean, you talked about the fact that this bill, if passed, would substantially increase public funding, but there's no corresponding idea, as you said, that they would have to spend it on accurate advertising. And we currently have no truth in political advertising laws at the federal level. Would that be a good trade-off for the government to make? Well, not a trade-off, like that is in the public's interest. If we are going to be paying more for their public funding, which I don't necessarily have an objection to, surely we should have some guarantee that they'll be honest when they're advertising to us.
That's right. It's perfectly legal to lie in a political ad in Australia, and it shouldn't be, and it doesn't have to be. South Australia's had truth in political advertising laws for about 40 years at this point, and we know they work. We know that they don't work perfectly 100% of the time, but you can see actual misinformation campaigns being nipped in the bud by the exercise of these laws. And at the same time that the government introduced the bill proposing changes to political finance, they also introduced the Electoral Communications Bill, which would bring in a truth in political advertising system at the federal level. I've read through the bill. I think it's a solid piece of work, and it could be passed alongside the donation transparency rules, and then we'd have something in place to protect against deep fakes, social media disinformation, and the misleading political advertising campaigns that can otherwise be funded through public money.
Thanks for joining us, Bill.
Thanks for having me.
If you want to see a detailed analysis of the government's proposed electoral reforms from Bill and our other colleague Joshua Black, you can click on the link in the show notes. And thanks to all the Australia Institute supporters who chipped in to support that research. We would love to hear your thoughts on the show today, and you can reach out to us via email at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au, or you can find us on social media. We're at australiainstitute.org.au on Blue Sky and at the Oz Institute with an AUS on Instagram and Twitter. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.